All right, Balance of Terror. This is an interesting episode because of the fact that it's the one that introduces the Romulans as a race. It introduces the Romulan neutral zone. It is the first time in the original series that we see cloaking technology. And there's a whole lot of things this episode does for the first time. And possibly the most interesting one, and what makes it most memorable, is the fact that it establishes that the Romulans are actually bad guys who kind of sort of have a good point and are thus, respectable enemies and not just people you're here to shoot. So, what happens in the episode other than, the Romulan stuff? Okay, so, episode has an interesting subplot, which is this woman by the name of Angela Martine, who is a lieutenant on the ship, and this guy by the name of Robert Tomlinson, who is also a lieutenant on the ship, who are getting married. And yeah, they just happen to do this right before the Enterprise has to go deal with these Romulans. Now, this is an interesting aspect of this that gets done and redone differently depending on who is adapting the story. Because in the episode as aired, Robert Tomlinson dies, and thus his... Well, it's actually not even clear whether or not he officially married her in the episode as aired. I think that his wedding actually got interrupted. So they didn't actually finish the wedding ceremony. Although whether or not that it counts as them being legally married depends on the specific laws, because, I mean, in modern laws, a lot of places the bride and groom are considered legally married when they, fill out the paperwork, and the ceremony is just a formality. So, whatever. In some variations of this, Robert and Angela both live, but this Lieutenant Stiles guy dies. And then there's variations where Angela dies and, whatever. The reality is, this whole thing is there as, like, to add suspension and tension. Because, they're not going to kill off any of the main cast, but these minor characters that you've never seen before, maybe. Anyway, though, yeah, that's kind of a side plot. So, let's get to the main plot, because that's what we're here for. The Romulan Star Empire is the main focus of the episode. Now, there are several things about this that are worth remembering. First is that this episode actually establishes very few things about Romulans. It's their debut. It doesn't do a deep dive into their history. It establishes a lot of things about their history, but there's a lot that it doesn't really cover. And, if you were actually introducing your own race, that's kind of a good way of handling it. Because, you don't want to overload people with a giant pile of details that you may or may not actually use later. It's a recurring theme when people make up their own stuff. Like, hey, I created this 20-page backstory. No one's reading that. Anyway, though, in the case of Romulans in Star Trek, it's a race that got used repeatedly over the years, and each time it got used, they added a few things to it. And what made them such an interesting race, though, is, like I said, the whole thing about being, they're an enemy, but they're an enemy that you can talk to and, maybe make deals with. Not just some thing that you're here to shoot. And that is part of the reason why Spock spent so much time talking to Romulans. Yeah, as for the Romulan people, it's like they look a lot like Vulcans because the race actually came from Vulcan. Yay, that's fun. Yeah, genetically they're not exactly the same as Vulcans, but whatever. Anyways, moving on. Romulan history. One of the biggest things in this episode that gets brought up is the Earth-Romulan War, and the fact that the treaty ending the Earth-Romulan War established the neutral zone and talking about all of the things that are expected as part of the existence of the neutral zone. And that, um, says a lot about the whole thing. And one of the things that's interesting about this episode, though, is that it suggests that Vulcans don't actually know who Romulans are at this point in history. The Vulcans, the race that are the same people who come from the same homeworld, don't actually know that the Romulans came from their planet. That's interesting. And several things have, tried to explain that, but the exact understanding that the writer who put that down had as the reason for it is extremely unclear. And like uh yeah, that's the sort of thing that you would just like make up your own stuff, honestly, if you're creating a new race. If you're using Romulans, you're probably better off just using Romulans and not bothering with the whole like mystery of, ooh, who are these cool new aliens we've definitely never seen before. They're Romulans. Everyone knows who Romulans are. At least people who've watched Star Trek. Anyway, though. So, this specific episode, the action takes place in Sector Z6. Because the Romulan crew of a experimental warbird has been going around blowing up the Federation outposts in the sector. They only actually get through with destroying 3 of them. Outposts 2, 3, and 4. Which, due to their strategic importance, do actually get rebuilt. Because, strategic importance. They're actually just small listening posts, honestly. And given how heavily fortified Outpost 4 is said to be, the Federation probably did spend a significant amount of time working on building the things. It's just that, it's not a large thing, even if it's something that does take a significant amount of effort to build for something so small. Let's see. Outpost 2, yeah, it's just something that's like marked on the map. It's like, oh, that one got exploded. And like, oh, that one got exploded. It's all we really know about Outpost 3. Outpost 4, though, we actually do end up seeing what it looks like. And, yeah, it's described as being something that actually had pretty hefty shielding. Shielding equal to that of the Enterprise. Anyways, so, sorry, I had to sneeze. Yeah, it had deflector shield, like actual metal armor. But the Romulans are using an experimental new Plasma Torpedo that is theoretically capable of one-shotting the Enterprise. Yeah. That's a fun thing. This is actually something that's an interesting thing to ponder for making up your own stuff. Is What kind of weapons do the enemies that your players are fighting actually use? What can you do to surprise them? The beach ball of death was definitely something that was a nasty surprise that people found to be formidable and a bit intimidating. Because like Kirk running in terror to avoid having the Enterprise blown up by this thing was quite a memorable scene. Now, what you have your enemies do in your game, well, that's different. But that was the interesting thing with this, though, is that the Romulans weren't just like blowing things up at random. They're destroying the Federation outposts that are monitoring the neutral zone. Specifically, those. And only those. Because, again, it's the whole, like, bad guys who kind of sort of have a point thing. Because, like, yes, they're your enemy, but they're not doing this just because they're dicks. They're doing this because they have a specific plan, and they're looking out for their own interests. And here we have the titular, or not titular, but the enemy ship of note here. The enhanced version firing the Plasma Torpedo. Surprise! The funny thing with this is that this ship supposedly only has one weapon, because the fact that this particular weapon takes so much space in the ship's systems that they basically don't have room left over in the ship for conventional weapons. Some of the computer games that also have this particular style of weaponry in them had a refinement for the technology where you can basically just fire smaller versions of the beach ball of death, so you don't have to channel the enormous amount of power required to fire the full-size beach ball, and you could just do like half-size or quarter-size ones instead of the full-size one. Obviously, those have less stopping power, but they're quicker to fire, and they don't drain your ship's power supply so heavily. And that's something that I would seriously consider if it was a combat scenario in a TTRPG. Because if your opponent's weapon is literally one trick, then it's pretty easy for your players to figure out how to avoid it. So giving the enemy more options, because like, well, one of the other tricks is actually to it's the same charge up to do the big giant beach ball, but instead of firing a single beach ball, it actually fires several of them. It's like, oh no, now there's more than one. Eek. Anyways, so one of the coolest things about this episode, and what went a long ways to the whole like bad guys who kind of have a point sort of thing, is they actually spent a significant amount of time with the Romulan characters exploring the motives of the Romulans. And while these characters don't end up with particularly complex or detailed backstories, we do get to see their perspective on the things, and it's like there's the one guy who, he kind of has political connections. It's like he's not a bad officer, but he's, a little bit of a nepo baby, because he got his job due to his political connections as much as or more than his actual skills as an officer. And you have this guy who, he's your consummate professional who he's a ship commander and he gets things done. And that's the reason why he has been given this prestigious mission by the Romulan Praetor himself. Or herself. Yeah, we don't actually know who's the Romulan Praetor in the original series at this time. That's something that literally never gets shown. Alternate timelines have done things with that, but not the original series. It's like, it actually is canonical that the Romulans aren't actually opposed to the idea of having a woman as the leader. The question is whether or not they actually do, because they're not opposed to having men as the leader either. Just whoever happens to do a good job. Anyways. But yeah, all these guys get killed. This guy gets killed before the other two because the ship gets damaged and this guy dies, and they like fling about his body out the airlock as and jettison random bits of debris in an attempt to trick the Enterprise into thinking their ship was completely exploded. Again, the bad guys are thinking and plotting. And that's what made Romulans so much fun. They're enemies you need to outwit. They're not enemies that you just shoot harder and the encounter is over. You have to avoid having the Romulans trick you and then gank you by surprise. Anyway, though, all right. See you guys later.